Ethiopian Airlines has ordered more Boeing 737 MAX and Boeing 787 aircraft, with a firm order of up to 31 aircraft. The airline also has options for 21 and 15 more aircraft of the type, respectively. This is the news coming out of the 2023 Dubai Air Show. Must be nice. I apologize if I sound salty at the news that Ethiopia has ordered 31 more airplanes. It's probably because our national airline, Air Zimbabwe, only has 8 planes in total. And of those 8, only 3 are operational. I know. It feels like I'm comparing apples to oranges, but really, I'm comparing oranges to oranges. It's just that one of these oranges is from food lovers. That's why it feels that way, but they are the same thing. Over the past few weeks, images generated by artificial intelligence depicting what Air Zimbabwe could potentially look like have been trending on social media. There were some who actually believed that these images were real and were very quick, didn't waste time, very quick to offer congratulations to the new dispensation. Do we still have to call it the new dispensation 7 years later? Clearly, we need to define the term limits for the word new, but that's neither here nor there. Congratulatory messages were shared, and those who pointed out the anomaly were called haters. I don't know if that's testament to how desperate we are as a nation for anything that resembles good news, or if it speaks more to how good the ZANU-PF praise and worship team is. It's probably both, but we really don't have time to figure that out today. What you might have figured out by now is that this week's episode is about Air Zimbabwe. We are going to try and take a look under the hood. Maybe we will find out what exactly has kept this airline from soaring to greater heights. How does Air Zimbabwe make money? Does it make money? How does it compare to other regional airlines? Can Air Zimbabwe be saved? But more importantly, should it be saved? Ladies and gentlemen, war vets and unfocused youth, welcome to another episode of Propaganda with Kandoro. We need context, so we will have to go back in time, right back to where it all started. In 1967, Air Rhodesia was formed. I know it's history, but just saying the word Rhodesia just rubs me the wrong way. But let me focus. In 1967, Air Rhodesia was formed, breaking out from the Central African Airways, which was a creation of the Federation. At its formation, it serviced internal routes to Buffalo Range, Bulawayo, Fort Victoria, Kariba, and Victoria Falls. Within 3 years, Air Rhodesia had added regional routes which included Johannesburg, Durban, Beira, Villankos, Lourenço, Marques in Mozambique, and Blantyre in Malawi. 12 years later, Air Rhodesia was changed to Air Zimbabwe Rhodesia. This was during the time when whites decided to pull off one of the longest April Fool's pranks on Bishop Abel Muzorewa. Within a year, the guys that had painted the name Air Rhodesia Zimbabwe were asked to come back and rub off the Rhodesia part, because independence, Air Zimbabwe is not a case of when did things go wrong. No, it's more of when did things get worse, because things have always been turbulent. Before independence, Rhodesia was under sanctions because of Ian Smith's UDI, and that meant Air Rhodesia was denied access to most regional and international markets. Those sanctions also affected the airline's ability to get spare parts and aviation fuel. Post-independence, the sanctions were lifted and Zimbabwe was integrated into the global community of nations. Yay! But it meant the country inherited a greatly dilapidated fleet of planes. 1981 is the only year that Air Zimbabwe made a profit in the first decade. I'm guessing that's largely because my comrades were very excited to finally get on a plane without fearing that there would be a Rhodesian somewhere who might just get inspired by Joyce Mjulu. If you know, you know. But I'm guessing that once the novelty wore off, they were like, yeah. By 1985, Zimbabwe had the oldest fleet across the 22 African nations that had planes. This is according to a report by The Economist in 1988. In 1986, already tired of bailing Air Zimbabwe out every year, the government commissioned Justice George Smith to inquire what exactly kwenzakalani. The commission's findings were pretty damning. Amongst a litany of problems, the main one presented to Parliament that July was that of poor corporate governance. This was back in 1986. You might as well just dust off that report, change the date, and just claim it's a 2023 report. Let's create a timeline of sorts. In February of 2004, Air Zimbabwe was temporarily suspended by the International Air Transport Association over unpaid debts. Then in May 2011, the airline was suspended from the association's financial and booking system over unpaid booking fees. The government promised to absorb the $140 million debt. But you know our government promises. If it's not a matter of life and death, you might as well figure it out. But even if it's a matter of life and death, that life better be the life of a political, remember. Otherwise, in February of 2012, Air Zimbabwe was placed under judicial management. A few months later, it was announced that Air Zimbabwe would be grounded indefinitely. But a few months later, government established Air Zimbabwe Private Limited and resumed operations servicing the Bulawayo, Harare, and Victoria Falls route. In 2013, over 600 employees were laid off as part of a cost-cutting measure aimed at recapitalizing the airline. Those employees would go on to sue the airline and win in a landmark ruling. In May 2017, Air Zimbabwe was one of the 117 airliners that were banned from flying in the European Union airspace due to unmet international aviation and safety standards. In June 2018, it was reported that Air Zimbabwe had debts of more than 300 million and could no longer fly to most destinations due to threats by debtors to impound its aircraft. Imagine an airline having to sneak around in the skies, hiding behind clouds because it owes money internationally. The jokes write themselves. With mounting debt and only 3 aircraft operational, the airline was put under administration on 6 October 2018. It's like an on and off switch that they like to like. At the peak of its powers, Air Zimbabwe serviced a modest route network of regional and international flights, the most popular route being the Harare-London Gatwick route. We all know why. Air Zimbabwe even had flights to Athens, to Frankfurt. The Harare-Perth-Sydney was done in association with an Australian airline, Qantas. Who can forget the iconic Harare-Singapore, Harare-Kuala Lumpur routes? Very popular in January when a certain former head of state would be on leave. A study done in 2017 on Air Zimbabwe found out that 55% of the managers employed at Air Zimbabwe had less than 1 year of service in their current positions, meaning the majority of personnel did not have the necessary experience to be effective in their designated fields. The study also found out that Air Zimbabwe had no managers with more than 20 years of service in the airline, indicating high management instability and high staff turnover. Some managers at Air Zimbabwe had no schooling or relevant education in aviation, and yet they were in high management positions. Air Zimbabwe was found to have an aged fleet averaging over 25 years. This was back in 2017. It's now 2023 and I haven't heard of any new planes, have you? The simple mathematics with planes, as is the case with everything else, is the older anything is, the more you spend fixing and maintaining it. The reason why Air Zimbabwe can't guarantee punctuality when it comes to flight times is because they too don't know if their nearly 40-year-old Boeing will want to come into work. I mean, as a 30-something-year-old, I get it. Because some days, you just want to sleep in. Some days you just like, eh. On top of these very potent problems, try adding a little bit of political instability, a little bit of corruption, foreign currency shortages. Try adding more sanctions. In 2012, Nicholas Goche, who was then the Minister of Transport, had this to say: President Mugabe is the only one who has made Air Zimbabwe fly because he charters an aeroplane and he pays before flying. Even just last week, he chartered Air Zimbabwe aircraft to Bulawayo for the Council of Chiefs meeting and is unlike ministers like myself who find either a South African Airways or British Airways. A week after this comment was made, Air Zimbabwe was grounded, due in part to a $150 million debt. The president must have been paying in Zim dollars. In October 2016, Air Zimbabwe applied to the State Procurement Board for permission to acquire 4 Boeing aircraft from Malaysia Airlines. Permission was granted in November of that same year. These negotiations were carried out in secret. Even those that were in the upper echelons of the transport industry were not aware. The argument that was made was that too many cooks in the kitchen would have spoiled the highly sensitive deal. But we know someone wanted to steal. Enough money was put together, but it was only to pay for 2 Boeing planes and 1 Embraer jet. But by the time the planes arrived in Zimbabwe, Air Zimbabwe had deteriorated to the extent that it could not present a credible plan to run the planes on a sustainable, profitable basis. And that's how the government came about registering Zimbabwe Airways. Robert Mugabe then said to his son-in-law, Simba, go play with other pilots. The man who had successfully lied on his dating profiles about being a captain, when in fact he was just a first mate, was officially appointed the chief operating officer of the new airline. There are records of large sums of money being released by the Reserve Bank for Zimbabwe Airways operating expenses. But to this day, there is no record of Zimbabwe Airways ever applying or receiving an air operator's certificate from the Civil Aviation Authority. The only thing that removed Simba from his position at the top of this Ponzi scheme was the change of landlord that happened at State House in November 2017. Otherwise, he probably would be there to this day, still sharing Zimbabwe Airways business cards. These are the kind of people and the levels of corruption that have hounded Air Zimbabwe since the mid-90s. How does Air Zimbabwe compare to the region and beyond? Well, Ethiopian Airways has the largest fleet on the continent with 140 aircraft in service, flying to 53 international destinations with 157 weekly international departures from Addis Ababa and 410 weekly international departures worldwide. In 2021, the airline is reported to have flown over 7 million travelers, with Egypt Air coming in second with 4 million passengers. Egypt Air operates 92 passenger planes and 23 cargo planes as of 2021. They fly to more than 25 destinations across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. At the recent Dubai Air Show, Egypt Air announced an order of 10 Airbus A350 planes. Must be nice. Rwand Air started operating in 2002, but already operates to 22 destinations in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. In its first few years, Rwand Air operated just a small domestic and regional network with leased and second-hand aircraft. Now they have purchased a significant number of planes. Just look at how small Rwanda is compared to us. Even Air Botswana flies to 8 destinations. While you digest that piece of information, let's hear a quick word from our sponsors.
What is it that's led you to giving back so much to the country that gave birth to you? Even when you really can just move on with your life and can enjoy life overseas and just use the money to make yourself happy and to treat yourself to all the pleasures of this world. What is it that made you so determined to continue to have an impact back home?
So I think for me, Zimbabwe has always been my place of belonging, where I am accepted, I'm celebrated, and I have that sense of nurturing from Zimbabwe. As I get older, as my father has died, as my mother is getting older, there's a question I still ask myself: would that sentiment remain even when they're no longer there? And I say absolutely yes, because that was the place of my identity. It's the place that made me understand who I am in this world. And I think there's something in me that's always said, I must return home. So home will always be home. I can be comfortable, I can be resident somewhere else, I can be a citizen somewhere else, but Zimbabwe is my place of belonging.
I love that. I love that.
Having said all this, is there any saving Air Zimbabwe? Even if it could be saved, should it be saved? There are many people who have argued for the complete closure of Air Zimbabwe. In 2011, Takalani Matibe, who was then the Chegutu West legislator, campaigned hard for this measure, arguing that Air Zimbabwe was way, way, way beyond redemption and a hard reset was necessary. While it's very easy to burn everything to the ground and attempt to start afresh, that approach doesn't always guarantee success. Having seen how our government handled the second coming of Zupco, I have zero faith. None whatsoever. But the situation is not unique to ZANU-PF and our government. Even across the border in Zambia, efforts to resuscitate Zambia Airways after it was closed in 1995 have been touch and go. It looks like the only way past this problem is through it. Running an airline is not easy for anyone. Industry experts claim that Ethiopian Airlines is the only African airline that has been profitable in recent years. Even Egypt Air, with its fairly decent fleet, had a $900 million loss in 2022. Kenyan Airways is reported to have lost about $149 million in the first quarter of this year. What more an airline that a former president used to use as daily hospital delivery? That level of impunity is what needs to go first. No more appointing people to important and strategic positions within the airline on the basis of totems. Air Zimbabwe should not be treated like a Christmas gift. I'm cautiously optimistic that the new appointment of Edmund Makona as the substantive CEO of Air Zimbabwe will mount to something. Surely his reported 38 years of aviation experience should count for something, right? Right? Some very hard decisions will need to be made if Air Zimbabwe is to get back to a place where it can be considered a functional airline again. The entire system needs an overhaul. Things that seem mundane, such as punctuality, service quality, even the attitude of customer service needs to change if people are to choose and trust Air Zimbabwe with their money again. All available evidence suggests that the airline needs to reduce its staff to plane ratio, which as of 2017 was 200 to 1. That's 200 people for one every single plane, compared to the industry average of 127 to 1. Air Zimbabwe is clearly overstaffed. The marketing at Air Zimbabwe should be part of the national tourism strategy. The airline should not try to be heroes and operate in isolation. It's a pretty damning indictment of the state of affairs that the Minister of Tourism was seen cosplaying as a flight attendant on a fast jet flight, and yet Air Zimbabwe flies that very same route. They still fly that same route, right? I very much subscribe to the idea of rebranding Air Zimbabwe. At no point should a national carrier have to use the ever sharp 15 AM write down boarding passes. But the changes should go beyond a rebrand. The root causes need to be dealt with. Corruption and mismanagement. Your work is cut out for you, Mr. CEO. I won't lie, some of those AI pictures looked... If only there was a way to run Air Zimbabwe via artificial intelligence. If only. But in the wise words of Mbuyane, there is only so much artificial intelligence can do, Msekuru. This has been another episode of Propaganda with Kandoro. I'll catch you guys in the next one.